Hi, in this video we're going to be talking about the creepy crawly worms. One of the most surprising things about worms is the variety of which they exist. There are 3 different animal phyla that all are types of worms. So we have the Platyhelminthes, which are the flatworms. Remember that they're very, very simple and they're acoelomate. They don't even have a body cavity. Today's video will focus on the other 2, roundworms, also known as nematodes, and segmented worms, also known as annelids. We'll start with annelids. So annelids would be, as I said, segmented worms, the most familiar of which is probably the earthworm. Leeches, mealworms are also great examples of annelids. As we talk about their characteristics used for classification, the most notable are, of course, that they are bilateral. They are coelomates, remember, full body cavity. They are triploblastic, so they have a mesoderm, endoderm, and ectoderm. And they're protostome, so their mouths develop first. One of their most notable characteristics is that they're segmented, which is very easily observable. Here in this diagram of a cross-section, we can see this almost like this wall. That wall is called a septa, and it separates the earthworm's body. That offers a great deal of advantages. It provides for greater ability to move. As you know, earthworms can regenerate, and so that helps them survive damage. And additionally, a lot of them have the potential to be specialized, so we can have much more specialized parts because of that segmentation. When we talk about earthworms, all worms have a hydrostatic skeleton. Recall from our earlier notes that a hydrostatic skeleton is a fluid-filled cavity, and that fluid, remember, you can't compress a fluid. And so when their muscles squeeze, the muscles squeeze against that fluid and allows them something for their muscles to pull on or push on. This also gives them rigidity and support. Additionally, when we talk about movement, it's important to note that they also have setae. Setae are these little projections you can see in this picture right there that help aid their movement. It gives them almost a little bit of traction, almost like cleats do for athletic shoes. This is a great time to pause if you need to catch up on your notes. Keep in mind that if you already know something like what a hydrostatic skeleton is, you don't need to rewrite it. Also, let's take a minute and review. Let's discuss some of the annelids' body systems, starting with their digestion. So annelids are more advanced for invertebrates, so they have a more advanced digestive system. They have a full digestive tract, so they have a mouth and a separate anus. And within that digestive tract includes a number of organs that help them digest their food. Many annelids eat soil. Certainly not all by any means, but many of them do. And so they take in food through their mouth. A structure known as a pharynx helps them pull food into their mouth. It goes through an esophagus into a body part called the crop. The crop is really a holding area. It's a little bit muscular, but mostly it holds food until it's ready to go into the gizzard. The gizzard is a muscular sac, much like our stomach. And in addition to having muscles, there's stone-like structures in there. And as it goes like this, it helps churn up the soil and extract any nutrients that could be found in the soil, such as microorganisms. The food then passes through the intestines where the nutrients are absorbed and then, of course, out through the anus. One of the hallmarks of a complex animal is a closed circulatory system, which we find in the annelids. When you dissect them, you'll see that there is a dark structure running down their body on both the ventral and dorsal sides. That is the blood vessel, essentially. Near the anterior side is 5 rings that you'll see, and those are essentially pumps, like hearts. Their respiration, however, is simple. They respire through their skin, which is why earthworms need to stay damp. If they dry out too much, that respiration won't occur. So they diffuse through material. There are a very small group of annelids that live in the water, and they have gills. Hit pause here if you need to. If you're a really great specimen, hopefully it will look something like this. The mouth is a little bit hard to see. Usually your cut obscures it. Just behind the buccal cavity, or the mouth, is the pharynx. Remember, that pulls food in. The esophagus is underneath all this stuff, so it's a little tricky to see. Then we have our crop, our storage area. The muscular sac you can see here is that thicker band. It's got much more muscle tissue than the rest of the digestive tract. And then it goes into the esophagus and eventually off to the side, the anus. This line on the top is the dorsal blood vessel. We're looking at the top of the worm. You'll also notice the dorsal blood vessel goes into this, and you can see there's a bit of one here, and you can see one here, 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 and here. Those are the hearts, those pumps. Let's pause for a moment and review. Moving on to other body systems, we have the excretory system. If you recall, platyhelminthes had flame cells. Annelids have structures known as nephridia. Nephridia, here's one nephridium. There's one in each body segment, and it's this looped-like structure that's used as a filter as it goes through our blood, or through the worm's blood, excuse me, and out through this pore. So there's a pore and a nephridium in every segment. Like many of the invertebrates, instead of a brain, annelids have a ganglion. They also have a nerve cord. Their nerve cord runs along their belly. Though they lack the ability to see, they can sense light, and they also can sense vibrations. As far as the reproduction goes, annelids reproduce sexually, and most of them have separate sexes. Earthworms and leeches, however, are hermaphrodites, so any two earthworms that find each other, they're good to go. One very noticeable structure on an earthworm is called the clitellum. The clitellum is this structure here. It's often seen here. Looks like a thicker band and often a different color. That is the structure which the offspring will develop into a cocoon. That cocoon looks something like this structure here, and the larvae look like this. Their eggs look like that. They also can reproduce asexually. Remember, regeneration means that each part of them can regrow into a new worm. It's also worth noting that the larval stage of an earthworm or any annelid is very similar to that of a mollusk. This, of course, suggests a common ancestry. Remember that mollusks and annelids are both members of Lophicotrozoa. This is a good spot to pause if need be. When we dissect, you probably won't get to see any of the nervous system. In this diagram, it's the green section here. This is their ganglia and their nerve cord running along their belly side or their ventral side. In this diagram, it's the blue bit. You'll also notice the nephridia. Remember, there's one in each segment. It's green here and yellow in this diagram. The other very noticeable thing is the seminal vesicles. Seminal vesicles are what make the sperm, and they're very large and on top of the heart, which we can see very clearly here. These larger lobes are the seminal vesicles. They make semen or sperm, and these smaller that are both ventral and anterior to those are the seminal receptacles. They receive the sperm after mating. Let's take a moment and review. In talking about the ecological importance of annelids, one of the primary things to note is that they are a prey species. They have an important role in the food chain. Number one, things eat them. You've probably heard the phrase, the early bird gets the worm. It's cliche for a reason. And number two, they are decomposers and detritivores. And so by being those organisms who recycle nutrients, they play an incredibly important role. Another very important thing they do for us is they aerate the soil. So as they move through the soil and eat the soil, that makes holes that water and nutrients can rinse into the soil and provide ecosystems for other organisms as well as our crops. Also, you're probably familiar with the idea that leeches will suck blood off of organisms. In order to do that, they need to prevent their host from clotting. And so historically, leeches were used like right on somebody to prevent clotting, however, and to increase circulation. Nowadays, we use the chemicals that leeches produce to do that rather than actually putting a leech on somebody. Finally, it's important to note that there is an environmental concern when it comes to worms, and that is we buy worms at bait shops to go fishing, of course. However, the worms that we buy at bait shops aren't always the kind that are local. Earthworms, for example, in this area of Wisconsin, are not native, especially the kind from bait shops. And so a lot of times people will go fishing, use what they want, and then just toss the rest thinking, oh, worms are good for the environment. But by putting the non-native worms into our ecosystem, we can have the potential to do real damage. Pause here if you need to. A couple more tidbits of information to keep in mind. The first is their habitat. Remember that while there are some marine worms, most other worms are going to be earthworms that live in the soil. However, because they diffuse through their skin for respiration, they need to be in moist environments. So cold environments and dry environments are not going to be suitable for that. Also keep in mind that annelids are most closely related to mollusks. Let's take a moment and review. In talking about segmented worms, we should also be familiar with their diversity. So the first group that we'll discuss, the first class, is Polychaeta. They're free-living marine worms. Their most noticeable characteristic is these parapoda. Parapoda means almost feet. And so it's all these little projections that are coming off of their body. Their job is a couple of things. They help move and anchor the worm. They also increase the area of which they can be used for gas exchange. Ogleochaeta are the earthworms that so many of us are familiar with. They live primarily in soil. And finally, the leeches are parasitic. Let's take one last moment and review annelids before moving on. Our last type of worms are roundworms. Now, roundworms are a little bit different. Back in the day, we used to talk about roundworms before we talked about annelids, because we were looking kind of at an increasing complexity. But as we learn more about the ancestry of organisms, we realize that roundworms are actually more closely related to arthropods. And the reason why is they're both members of the group Ecdysozoa. Ecdysozoa are known as grouped together because of similar ancestry and because they are protostomes with bilateral symmetry and a cuticle, or an outer covering. In other words, they're not part of the large group Lophicozoa. In the past, our cladogram showed a simple basic progression of complexity. Our new understanding of ancestry shows us Ecdysozoa with nematodes and arthropods together. Again, it's because of that cuticle, and therefore as they grow, they must molt. The picture on the left is a picture of a roundworm cuticle. Of course, the picture on the right is the exoskeleton of an arthropod that's molting. Here's another view of the nematode cuticle. This is a cross-section prepared on a microscope slide. So notice we have our muscle tissue, and superficial to that, we have this kind of orangish layer, and that's the epidermis, which in humans we call our skin. And finally, the outermost layer is the cuticle. That's the protective coating that the roundworm must shed, just like an arthropod. So let's talk roundworms. Roundworms are members of the phylum Nematodata, and Nematodata have a number of characteristics that are unique to them. So as I mentioned, they're called roundworms. And their general characteristics are that they're cylindrical, but as you notice, though they're round, they are tapered at one end, so one end is much fatter than the other. As worms, they have bilateral symmetry. However, unlike annelids, they are unsegmented, so they're simpler. They have much more limited movement. They have a protostome development, so mouth first, but they are pseudocoelomates. So pseudocoelomates, remember, means that though they have a cavity, the cavity is not completely lined with mesoderm. This diagram shows a cross-section of a nematode. Notice once again here we have our pseudocoelom, or this cavity in the middle, but mesoderm, or muscle tissue, is only lining the outer portion, and the digestive tract is completely exposed to the cavity, making it a pseudocoelom. Also notice that there's all three tissue layers, so roundworms, like many of the other more complex animals, are triploblastic. Like the other worms, they're supported by a hydrostatic skeleton, or remember that fluid-filled cavity that their muscles can squeeze on. Unlike the other worms, however, their muscles run lengthwise, and of course they're not segmented, and so that limits their movement. They thrash side to side instead of like inching or crawling along that we see with annelids. And remember, as far as their support goes, they also have that outer cuticle that functions protection and support. Here's a good spot to pause if need be. Also, let's take a moment and review. To learn more about nematodes, let's talk about their body systems, starting with digestion. So, roundworms can be free-living or parasitic. Parasitic roundworms typically need some adaptations on their mouth area to help them infect their hosts. Free-living roundworms are mostly decomposers, though some are predators of very small invertebrates. All of them have a one-way digestive tract, so a separate mouth and anus, like annelids. However, like flatworms, roundworms lack all respiratory and circulatory structures, so they rely on diffusion for those needs. Their excretion is also simple like flatworms. They either have flame cells or excretory pores. Excretory pores are typically found on slightly more complex roundworms, often those that live on land because they help conserve water. As far as response goes, they're fairly limited, much like flatworms. They have ganglia and nerve cord, and very limited sensibilities depending upon where they live, of course. Pause here if you need to. Their reproduction is fairly simple. They reproduce with sexes, so no hermaphrodites. They have internal fertilization. Eggs are laid, and free-living larvae hatch from the eggs. However, in parasites, it's a little bit more complicated because, of course, it involves the life cycle of the host as well. Sometimes the eggs are laid and then transmitted to a new host, or laid in one part of the host and they develop in another. So it's a more complicated process. Pause here again if you need to, and then let's review. As we talk about the ecological importance of roundworms, we have to talk about their sheer abundance and diversity. Some estimates are over 20,000 different species. They can live in damp soil or fresh water. Many of those who do are free living, and the free living ones are incredibly important for decomposition as well as nutrient recycling. It's estimated that a handful of soil contains millions and millions of nematodes. Some people say that nematodes are the most abundant animal, even though most of them we never see. Of course, there are lots of parasites. Parasites, as far as a human role, can make us sick. We'll talk about that in a moment. There's also lots of adaptations that parasites need. I touched on that earlier in terms of holding on to their hosts or getting into their hosts. Additionally, if you're going to be a parasite, you need to prevent your host from clotting and making a clot out of you. So you need to have some kind of anti-clotting capabilities. So we researched that for use in medicine. Parasites, nematodes in particular, are actually able to redirect blood vessels, which might have medical applications as well. As I mentioned, though, there are a lot of nematodes that are parasites that we should discuss. On the test, you should have a relative understanding of these, maybe an example or two, knowing that a tapeworm is a flatworm and these are roundworms. But I'm not going to test you on like the nitty-gritty of these. So one that's, I don't want to say cool because it's obviously not a good condition to have, but it looks kind of funky, is elephantitis, which is called by a filarial worm. The reason why this person's limb has gotten so big is their lymph nodes have been swollen and blocked by the nematode. Heartworm is one you're probably familiar with if you have pets, in particular dogs. A lot of us give our dogs heartworm preventative because it can be fatal. And of course it's because it's a roundworm that infects the hearts of pets. Ascaris is what we're going to dissect in class. It is free living. It's one of the larger roundworms. You can be infected with an ascaris if you eat unwashed veggies. So this poor boy has ascaris infection. Hookworms are another. Hookworms burrow into your feet. As their name implies, they have a hook-like structure on their mouth. Hookworms can be bad because they can migrate to your lungs, and then you can cough them up and get them into your intestines. Pinworms are, I'm sorry to say, really gross. Pinworms will actually crawl out of your anus. It causes itching, people scratch, and then it spreads. And so they can live on surfaces for a good long while, so make sure you're clean, especially in public places. Trichinella is another one that's a little gross. Eggs burrow into the intestines, the larva into your muscle, and so therefore you get it from meat, which is one of the many reasons why we cook our meat thoroughly. And guinea worm you can get by drinking the eggs in water. And this was a little gross too. As you can see from the picture, the adult crawls out of your skin, which certainly can't be comfortable. Thankfully, a lot of these are not in our area, but we do want to make sure we're careful in doing things like cooking our meals and being careful in public restrooms. Okay. Once again, it is important to note that I'm not going to ask you to have a great knowledge of each of these, just a general familiarity. Also keep in mind, especially those of you who have pets know this, that parasites are common not only to humans but also to pets, and so there's lots of non-human hosts that can be infected. Also, they can even infect plants. If you need to, pause here, but again, you don't have to write too much here. Maybe just be familiar with which ones are parasites and which ones aren't, and a little bit about how you get them. Okay, let's review worms one more time.